Tonight's lecture is we're actually part of two lecture series. It's part of the Patrick McCarthy lecture series. Patrick McCarthy was a professor here for many years, in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. He was a real intellectual. He wrote a great many distinguished books, including a famous one on Albert Camus, the French writer, which many people regard as one of the finest works on Camus. He was a brilliant teacher and a very generous personality. You can see his picture in room 201. Well, his students were so enthused by his legacy and career that they established a fund, and we used the fund to pay for lectures for people who are likely to bring a high level of intellectual content to their lectures, and so no pressure. It's also part of the History of the Present series, which is a series I've been running for several years now, which is basically on big events which seem likely to make history, and what caused them, why they're happening, what their significance is. And I think we can all, and we've had all kinds of very interesting people talking about this. We had Klaus Patel of the University of Munich, a very famous historian, last year talking about the New Deal, both the American New Deal in the 1930s and about the debate over whether we should have a New Deal today, and etc. And I think we can all agree that democratic recession in Central Europe falls into this category. Why? Well, you know, as some, certainly my student here will know, that Central Europe, the former communist states, were the apex, if you like, along with South Africa, of the so-called third wave of democratization, which began in the 1970s and concluded in the mid-1990s. The famous Velvet Revolutions, which swept away communist rule in Eastern Europe. I mean, this is an enormous, momentous event in contemporary history. How's democracy doing in Central Europe? Well, we're going to be finding out. Also, these countries all became part in 2004 of the European Union, and at the time were extraordinarily enthusiastic about becoming members of the European Union. I can remember reading myself Kindergarten Ash's famous book To the Magic Lantern and back, about to the Magic Lantern, about how the Czech intellectuals who were in the theatre plotting the overthrow of the communist state were talking all the time about how their future was in Europe, the centrality of Europe. Are these countries still pro-European? Well, you've probably seen from the press a good deal less than they used to be. Also, we all talk a lot about populism. Central Europe has seen the rise of populist, or even some people call them authoritarian liberal parties. In the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, you could go on. Yeah? So I think what's happening in Central Europe right now is really rather important. It looks likely to be of real significance for European studies, European politics, those of us who occupy some of this. The Czech Republic itself, because our speaker is from the Czech Republic and I'll introduce her in a moment, the Czech Republic recently had a general election. It was not contested by many parties, only 22, which is apparently significantly fewer than usual. And it was kind of drawn between a party called Arnold, which is led by Andrej Babiš, who is a millionaire, a kind of Silvio Berlusconi figure, and the Civic Democrats. The two parties basically both got 27-28% of the vote. The next party was the so-called Pirate Party, also a party though that's moving in the centrist direction. And there were quite a number of other parties which fall into the category of right-wing populist. I was talking with our speaker tonight before the election, and you know, if you add it up, you've got maybe 70% of the parties can be defined as populist, whether they're populist of the right or of the left. So we've got this very interesting fluid party system in the Czech. It's complicated. I used to think that, and still do think that explaining Italian politics is difficult. Explaining Czech politics is even more complicated, and I suspect Polish politics too. So I think it's really good that we have a real expert, right? And so I'll introduce our speaker. Adéla Gjuricová is head of the Department of Political History at the Institute for Contemporary History in the Czech Academy of Sciences. It's actually her third visit to Bologna. She came and gave a talk on Václav Havel in 1924, I believe, yes. And she also attended a conference that I organized here on Euroscepticisms and wrote a little piece for the book, which came out of that conference, The Skepticism of a Latecomer, Modern Czech Views of Europe, which I'm glad to say has been singled out by every single review that we've had of the book so far. It's been one of the most interesting chapters of the book. She's adjunct professor at Charles University in Prague. Hard life, someone has to do it. Actually got to teach in her class last year. Authentic 22-year-old Czech intellectuals. It was really quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, only by Zoom, but I'm hoping to talk about rights sometime. She works on Czech-Slovak relations, on the history of Parliament in Central Europe, particularly the recent history of Parliament, the history of post-socialism, i.e. what's happened in the Eastern Bloc, in the former Eastern Bloc since 1989, and on contemporary Central European politics. She's been, and still is indeed, a democratic activist, and for a while was a member of the Prague City Council. We disagree strongly on whether Havel's marvelous memoir To the Castle and Back is a good book or not, but otherwise she's been a good friend for several years and she's a real expert. Adéla, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this lovely introduction. The only criticism that comes from me is that you're always more funny than I can be, so it's difficult to follow. I would like to start with a description of a very recent situation. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, invited the French extreme right-wing presidential candidate Marine Le Pen to Budapest recently. They held talks, and after that, they had a joint press conference. And Viktor Orbán needed to explain what the so-called Brezhnev doctrine was in the communist era. He said it was a Soviet policy of actually intervening in any country of the Soviet bloc if that country was not complying with the central determined ideology. And then he concluded, we're seeing a modernized European Union form of this Brezhnev doctrine now experienced on a daily basis, not only by Poland, but also by Hungary. Why such distance from Europe? That's exactly the question of my lecture. And you should also know, and that's why I'm coming with this historical analysis of the whole problem. Why such an insult? You know, comparing anything to the Brezhnev doctrine is really aggressive. And Orbán did that, of course, on purpose. So the conceptual toolkit that I'll, at a very superficial level, because I only have 30 or 40 minutes to go, I will use during this lecture, starts with historicization. I'm saying it's complicated, but you need to know the even more complicated, longer story of the problems. I'm, for example, putting the election poster from 1990. It was a poster of Orbán's party, Fidesz, the so-called movement of young Democrats. And the Orbán's party is exactly these young people kissing, as opposed to the old communists, unaesthetic kissing that preceded. So they were the liberal young option. And Orbán himself was a liberal, a very well-known, successful and impressive liberal in the 1990s. My second approach that I use in lots of my research is so-called new institutionalism. It is a new sort of stream or direction in political history, which stops seeing institutions as these solid bodies given by their statutes, and sees institutions as much more fluid environments, as entities that can be actually very solid because they can survive regime changes, for example, but they can be also very fragile if aggressive newcomers come in the institution and change its character. And of course, we have to mention Euroscepticism. And my question for the debate is basically what I'm going to describe. And if Orbán's initial quotation is actually, is Euroscepticism or is it something else? Populism, I'll not go into that any further because Mark, throws that in as a concept that we need and as a really feasible description of, in fact, many party leaders in current, marketed politics. And then I'm quoting Viktor Orbán once more because he said, it's not that we're not democratic, we're just building a different democracy, so-called illiberal democracy. And I'm sort of offering that as a very interesting dilemma, whether these countries with, their basic loyalty to constitutional systems. I mean, all of them have constitutional systems. They have all the institutions, but somehow they're able to reach these institutions voting against some basic human rights and so on, or deciding against these. So how to call that? Some of my colleagues now started a project on so-called illiberal constitutionalism. So that might be, one of the ways of actually seeing that as a dilemma for democratic institutions. Where do they actually finish? As I said we have to go back and start from the very, scratch of, in fact, re-establishing democratic systems after the peaceful revolutions of 1989. And I suggest that there are of course many fallacies in the institutional framework of that time, but there is also a problem on the side of the Western world, because the Western world that knew exactly Václav Havel and his wonderful texts such as Power of the Powerless, they had a dream about Eastern Europe too. They thought that once the communist parties are defeated, these East Europeans would actually build different democratic systems, somehow systems that would be fertilized by the dissident thinking, that would have a better democracy than Western bureaucratic and sort of empty democracies would be. And this dream was very much confronted, painfully confronted with the post-communist government saying, no, we're not going into any third ways, with a lot of irony. We're not going into any further experiments. That's what the communists always try to do. We want exactly the system that you have. We want, this liberal democracy that you're saying is in crisis, whatever, we want that. What the post-communist governments did not know was that there's another part of the package, of the liberal democratic package, and that was the current fashionable neoliberal radicalism. So it was the East European governments, in fact, adopting a very radical way or type of globalized or globalizing neoliberal economic thought, with Margaret Thatcher being a hero who said we need to re-privatize, public infrastructure and we need to get rid of this expensive nonsense of public free public education or subsidized public education and healthcare. So this was really very influential in Eastern Europe, and also because this was a part of the advice given by prominent international institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. So this was a way of democratic transition that we're mostly not aware of, and once again the economic thought was a part of it. There are several more weaknesses that I can see because of my research of the 1990s and the early 2000s, and that are not mentioned when talking about democratic transitions most of the time. First of all, there was this systematic lack of experience and conceptual discussion on what was happening. With the privatization, for example, the only thing our governments knew about it is that it has to be done fast, quickly. And nobody asked about, okay, so which companies do we privatize? What do we not privatize? What do we actually keep up to the state and so on? This discussion was not led. Then second, the institution building was sort of undervalued. You know, nobody, when for example, electing new people into parliaments, you thought this was it. So now you have a freely elected parliament, but you never thought about that it's important what these people actually think the mission of parliament is. Do they understand the procedure? Who are they? What will they do in parliament and so on? And then there was this, you know, omnipresence of the politics of the past. So you could actually completely kill any idea if you said it's communist, or you could, you know, completely taboo any actor if you said he had been a collaborator with the secret service, and there were these you know scams and scandals produced around the past that were part of daily politics. So this is something what makes the institutional change really very untypical. On the right, you can see Václav Havel and the standing ovation for him in US Congress in February 1990. That is obviously still part of the dream. You know, Havel was a very welcome speaker throughout his presidential mandates. There were several in Czechoslovakia and then 2 other in the Czech Republic. But at the longer he gave these speeches, the less influential he was actually domestically. So there was the paradox, and this was to illustrate the Western dream, more or less. So I suggest that in the following years and sometimes decades, a substantial institutional failure followed. Slovakia was the earliest case. In 1992, the Czechs and Slovaks agreed on a breakup, or rather, Czech and Slovak governments, political parties agreed on the breakup of Czechoslovakia. You can consider that an institutional failure as well. But what followed in Slovakia were several years of authoritarian government. The guy on the right, Vladimír Mečiar, who was a great singer on TV or whatever, he really seemed like a comical figure, but he ran the country with really very, very strict authoritarian government. He combined the government with secret, with the intelligence. He threatened his opponent. He had the son of the president, Kovács, kidnapped, to pressure on his father to resign. It's completely unbelievable. The word mafia became, very widespread in Slovakia. And although Mečiar was defeated in the 1998 election, you can still have a sense of this, somehow growing the political elites in the police elites and so on. So it's a very long run in which Slovakia is actually getting rid of this heritage. The Czech Republic, I would say, was in the critical phase in the early 2000s. At that time, it was still considered the best pupil, one of the best pupils in the club, doing relatively fine economically, then not even suffering from the world recession, whatever. But at the same time, everybody knew that if you as a company want to take part in a public tender, for example, for a simple job, you really have to count these 5, in some communities even 20% for so-called engineering, which was basically in your budgets, which was basically a bribe for the local administration. So the corruption really grew into the simplest environments and the most basic environments, and there was a very radical reaction to it. I'm also mentioning the radicalization of politics around the year 2000 in all of Central Europe. You can mean Hungary and Viktor Orbán once again winning the election in 1998 by saying he would form a government for 15 million Hungarians. Now, you may know that Hungary actually doesn't have so many inhabitants. So what he meant were the Hungarian minorities in other countries, And once again, that was a radical radical statement, because he was actually saying, I'm going to, start mobilizing your Hungarian minorities. There were environmental issues around which there were huge conflicts. The Czech Republic had a conflict with Austria because Austria blocked the Czech EU entry because of a nuclear power plant in southern Bohemia, and so on. What I want to say is these were conflicts between the countries that we're talking about, and that's going to change to a substantial extent. What was the political reaction? The political reaction was very similar. I said in 1998, for example, Mečiar was defeated by a very broad opposition coalition. So just parties, these tiny parties, these fragmented parties uniting in protest coalition is a thing that works. And it has worked, it worked also recently. Then the other much more substantial and far-reaching effect was that the traditional socio-economic cleavages were suppressed so that you can build such a broad coalition. And the traditional ideologies started to sort of erode. So the new parties that I'm going to talk about are very unclear about being right-wing or left-wing. Professor Gilbert asked me in his office, so is this party right-wing? I said, well, who knows? So you really can't say that with all these new parties. So the new political parties and movements basically arose as successful business projects. And that was the case of the one of the party having this unbelievable, election billboard. All these three ladies became members of parliament. All these three ladies have good university degrees. And yet they were willing to pose in their swimming costumes. And not only that, they even produced an erotic calendar before the election. And the party made it to government with that. The party was really run by one man, a successful businessman. It was called Public Matters, Věci veřejné, and it said, lousy anti-political stuff. This was 2010, and since then, similar parties, took an ever bigger share of the party spectrum in each elections. So this is obviously a successful trend. This party didn't make it in the next parliament, but there were new successes. And the traditional parties very often tended to illiberal policies and Euroscepticism. And that's, for example, the case of the Civic Democrats, of the dominant power of the 1990s. Václav Klaus, their chairman, was the leader of these economic transforming governments in the 1990s. And by this time, he had to become a nationalist, and an anti-EU activist and all that. So something that he really had not been. The same case as Viktor Orbán. And I would like to show more of that process of how you actually become a successful populist of the case of the so-called ANO movement. This ANO is an abbreviation. It means the action of dissatisfied citizens. Right wing or left wing? Who knows? But in Czech, it also means yes. So this was a party which was calculated, or whose marketing was calculated from the first moment. It's a good name. It's an abbreviation which you can explain, or you just use the short thing, and it's positive, and it worked. It was founded in 2011 as an anti-corruption, anti-establishment party. And who was the founder? The founder was Andrej Babiš. So that's the guy here on the right. There he's hidden behind the cap, who is not only a successful businessman, he's one of the richest men in the country. He is the owner of most Czech agro-business. He had been member of the Communist Party. He had worked for the communist foreign trade companies. He's got that history, but then he profited from the privatization, became really rich, and he entered politics by saying something very credible, that even he himself can't do reasonable business in such a corrupt country. So somehow he reacted to the crisis that I described. and he, you know, instrumentalized it politically. Of course, he did wonderfully, you know, throughout the period, but this was something that seemed credible and that people, and in the first stage, even journalists actually believed him. They said, even if Babiš needs to set up a party, there must be something rotten, you know. So in 2014, well, it's also, you know, very typical that his political party called Movement doesn't have a democratic structure. You know, it formally has a presidium or something, but he's the leader. You know, he's the figure who everybody else is responsible to, and he points his finger to persons who finished. So it's really this one of these new movements that are very dangerous for the democratic. In 2013, in the first election they ever took part in, they gained almost 20%, and that's a huge proportion in this proportionate system that we have. And Andrej Babiš became finance minister. Now, if you smell something bad about that, you know, then you're right. He had bought the
richest man in the country became finance minister.
Yes. And you know, after his mandate, most of the smaller agro companies did not exist. How come? He had bought most central media outlets by then, you know. So I know I don't have to explain to people living in Italy, but still, this had a very strong effect on the Czech system. In 2017, they swept the election with almost 30% of the vote, and Andrej Babiš became prime minister. And now, once again, the rhetoric was, for example, we're not like politicians, we work hard. So the anti-political rhetoric worked even for this, you know, experienced finance minister. But ever stronger when he was prime minister, did he actually tend to this right-wing populism, right-wing radicalism, and his campaign from Czechia with his Trumpian hat, you know, was just the latest part of it. It was this Andrej Babiš that led the country through the COVID crisis. You can imagine. So that's when I claim he actually became left-wing, because he was sort of paying people for the suffering. You know, he increased all social benefits and the pensions, and he would send face masks when these were not available by mail to older people and stuff like that. So he became really a left-wing populist and suppressed the older, more right-wing votes, let's say. What I think of important factors in this whole development are certain longer traditions and continuities. I use the word anti-political many times, and I know that it's not so obvious what I actually mean by that, but there is really a tradition of intellectual thinking about other politics, about either amateurs doing it, people from below doing it, experts doing it. This is really a strong continuity. It has even deeper historical reasons, because the Czech lands were a part of the Austrian monarchy, and in there they didn't have their own political elite, so they sort of, you know, replaced it with intellectuals. At that time there were historians and painters who ran for the Austrian parliament and so on. So there is really something very deeply Czech about it. But it's also something very tempting in this world. So somehow you can see that these simple slogans of "we're not like politicians," you know, we do it otherwise. And even Andrej Babiš's "I'll run the state as a company, you know, I can do it," you know, which seemed tempting because people said, yeah, he's actually so rich that he would not steal from the public property, and you know, he can obviously run a big company, so why not one of the state? But there's nothing politically ideological about it, and that's really both a long tradition and a problem. Then I would say the second factor was that there is really generally little respect for political institutions and for institutions in general. Even the institution of law and law enforcement is actually very weak in our culture. So during the COVID crisis, people would always, consider the government provisions, the anti-epidemic orders or rules as something imposed on people by them, and not really being, our problem in our part. So it was always, they think they can impose this on us, something like that. So this distance from political institutions and disrespect for even keeping laws and so on. And then the third moment that I want to stress is the simplifying of electoral choice. There's many parties that come in the election with saying it's now or never. You have to decide now because otherwise everything is lost. It's yes or no. It's not about a spectrum. It's actually a dichotomy, and that's something. And it started in 1990. The first re-election was communists or this, and it was very successful then. But since then, you actually have had most elections that were dichotomy, and it's a problem in the long term because somehow you don't preserve the spectrum of positions. I mean, like rational positions on certain issues such as social security, public sector, privatization. These are complex issues, and you need a range of positions. So the current elections, and I'm saying the winner was someone slightly different. Anyway, Andrej Babiš did not win this last election, by which he, of course, spoiled my lecture, because the lecture was supposed to be about all these populists being successful. So he might be out of government very soon. The very complex structure that will replace him will be a coalition of 5 parties. 3 of them were part of the so-called Together coalition with the slogan, "We put the country back together." And then there was this coalition of the pirates, and I'll happily answer any questions about how do you actually have a government pirate party in the discussion, and the so-called mayors and independents. It seemed they will have a deal. They're really, negotiating about seats these days. But it's also very interesting that the election result came out differently from anybody expecting. And one of the aspects was actually sort of provoked by the photo on bottom right. That's the kickoff of the campaign of the most liberal young coalition, which was the pirates and the mayors and independents. The guy, also the speaker on the right, with his hair in dreads, was really expected to become the prime minister. A few months ago, the polls still spoke for him and his party. And then they launched the campaign in this way, showing 15 out of 16 regional leaders being male. And so of course there was lots of jokes on the social networks about that. But then what happened was that the voters used their preferential votes in such a way that their parliamentary fraction became the most feminized in Czech parliament. So people basically really selected women on their list and completely changed even the proportion of pirates and mayors and so on. So somehow there was this, institutional moment at which people could use the institution of elections in the right way and express their will. So there's a paradox of that, which of course causes huge conflicts within that coalition. But it was an important element. And I might say myself, have 3 children who went to the elections for the first time. And my daughter sat there and said, okay, I think I'll circle some women. So somehow there was this very gendered vote, which was not really, provoked by any, I would say, campaign, like gender equality campaign, but was very authentic, and it was reaction to this, this kind of policy, very traditional. And there's one more photo which I want, through which I want to express my doubts about this doubts. I mean, certain challenges of the previous election. The photo comes from the election night. It is taken at the headquarters of the right-wing coalition. So you can see all these people in the conservative blue suits, and they're chanting. And it's because the election result was actually changing during the night. And during the first hours, there were only smaller constituencies counted. Those were mostly in rural areas. And Babiš was actually very high. You know, he was getting huge proportions. And then during the night, when bigger cities were included in the counts, the anti-Babiš opposition coalitions were rising. And then Prague results completely swept the election in favor of the right wing together. And these people were standing there, and on TV you could say they were chanting Praha, 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 which means Prague, Prague. And I was sitting there and saying, like, okay, you still believe that the old divide, you know, of urban and rural doesn't exist? Aren't you actually producing yet another Babiš who will just collect all those angry votes of people who feel they're not represented by these people in blue suits and so on? So the simplification of elections, you know, to it's about killing Babiš and not about rational political positions on important issues, has unfortunately been a part of this victory over Babiš that we just experienced. And so this is, you know, the last slide. Has the transition to democracy, to constitutional democracy, actually failed? Well, if you think about all the nationalism that is used in political rhetoric of such European leaders, you could say so. If you remember their reaction to the immigration crisis and this completely, you know, united no to immigration voters of the European Union, they say yes. You, of course, you know, hear about the conservative positions of many of these countries on cultural issues such as LGBT rights, abortion rights, gender equality. I showed this photo on purpose, but there is also, I mean, even the Istanbul Convention, for example, is a problem. It has not been ratified in the Czech Republic because some politicians always say that it's ideological, it's genderism, whatever. So it's very interesting, you know, how different the position of these countries is. Then, of course, there is the conflict with the European Union. Poland is the leader in that, and that's why I'm including the cartoon recently published by The Economist with the Polish Prime Minister saying, I love EU, and undermining one of its central institutions. An economist, you know, said Poland actually practices, unlike the sort of clean leave of the Brexit, they practice a dirty stay and dirty remain. And they said Poland is a problem for the EU precisely because it will not leave. You know, you could have it leaving, but you can't have it not leaving and sort of demoralizing all the other member states by not reacting to EU procedures, by not paying the fines and so on. Then I think what is not traditionally liberally democratic is the elections constantly explained as referenda. I'm mentioning also the smart voting application in Russia, which is then up to discussion if you're interested. But I think it's a wonderful case of that dilemma. And to conclude, I want to say that in a well-functioning constitutional democracy, you actually can afford to lose. You know, that's the substance of the system. You can lose a lawsuit because you can appeal to a higher court. You can lose an election. You can lose in a vote for an academic position, whatever, because you're otherwise protected by the general rules of procedure, by the human and minority rights. And but that has one very important precondition, and that precondition is that the institutional and procedural framework is actually generally shared and accepted as fair by the population. And I would say that that feeling is really slightly eroding in Central Europe. And, you know, sometimes the journalist reports on, you know, Polish discussions on abortion or whatever, sometimes and other moral issues of you know, girls wearing long sleeves for PE lessons or whatever. Sometimes they're really more more dramatic than the reality is. You still have, very large parts of the country which lives in a liberal world, but the sense of sharing the framework of being sure about the rights really is eroding. So I'm once again, throwing the illiberal constitutionalism in because all of this is happening through a constitutional system and through constitutional institutions and their decisions. And then second, I'm actually suggesting that the populists are also very, both popular and dangerous, because they're basically expressing and mainstreaming certain sentiments. For example, feeling the distance from the European Union that is not only that does not only belong to Central or Eastern Europe, but is actually shared by certain segments of Western societies as well. And I think that's something that we're probably going to see in the French presidential elections, because there you have, for example, the probable candidate Michel Barnier, who was the EU negotiator of Brexit, and who is now, opting for more national sovereignty in the European Union and basically going against the principle. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm going to do is throw the floor open to questions in a moment. If anybody's watching, people who are watching us online, if you could use the Q&A function so I can see your questions. And you guys present, please give your name and nationality to preface any questions you have. But while you're gathering your thoughts, I'm just going to start with a couple of questions of my own, which maybe just to start the ball rolling, and then I'll open it up to the floor. Adéla, excuse me. No one can accuse you of being nationalist, right? You've been very hard on the political culture of your own country. And your own country, but I assume, and this is another question I wanted to ask you, you're generalizing. You spoke mostly about the Czech Republic, but I think you mean that most of the things you talked about are also applicable to Slovakia, they're also applicable to Poland, they're also applicable to Hungary and Romania, I imagine. So question, you basically said the political culture of your own country is corrupt, sexist, populist, and has no respect for law. Is that too strong? So that's my first question. And the second one, which you made a very interesting theoretical point, which the students of my democracy and its discontents class no doubt picked up on, and I'm sure we'll ask questions. You strongly implied that democracy is being eroded via democratic institutions, not against. I just wish you could say something about that too.
Thank you. These are, of course, very good and very difficult questions. With the generalization, I would be, very careful about that. I try to present a case study which I sort of showed in little of its historical development, but basically I wanted to imply that in different phases and connected with different crises, some of these countries and most of these countries have employed temporary nationalism and so on, and have used and instrumentalized exactly this conservative moral or cultural policy, because that might simply win them more support. They're not doing it because they would believe it, the leaders. I think they're doing it because they can sense the segment that it would win for them. And that's certainly the case of Poland. The Kaczynski brothers, one has died in the air crash, and the other is this sort of shadow, leader of the country. He always appoints and somehow chooses a prime minister and a president, but at the same time he's still in a lot of power. So he used to be the closest collaborator of Lech Wałęsa, and now you can't even say that name in a public gathering in Poland, because because La Valenza is simply the level of the anti-communist movement for the current government. So there are such complete turnovers in policies, and it simply can't be that Kaczynski now found out that Valenza was not fair to him. It's really, this is politics, and by your wonderful concentration of myself saying where I live in a nationalist, sexist, democratic culture, whatever. What I want to say by that is it can happen in certain cases, but it's really worth our attention if these countries, build a community around it. And if they even offer that as a positive Sonderweg, I would say, if they say, we're actually defending the healthy common reason against this nonsense of the European Union, that's where I would really say it's tricky. Because otherwise, politicians do stuff and whatever, but this unity of these countries, against the immigration quotas and against certain also gender issues and so on. So that's where I really feel appalled. And as for the eroding of democratic institutions via democratic institutions, I think that's the dilemma for all of us. That's exactly the question that I want to offer, because somehow these countries have all the institutions, but once the institutions do not allow the defeat of the leader, let's say, which, for example, Poland, seemed to be the case of for several years now, then it's really tricky. Once you manage to actually, run over all these institutions. So Poland is the crisis is around the constitutional court, for example, and now this court really works for the government.
Oh no, I wasn't interrupting you because we've literally just had a question from Marin Christensen of the US, who says, what role has the Czech Constitutional Court played in allowing growing populist sentiment? And will the Czech Republic run into similar rule of law issues or conflicts such as the one in Poland?
Yeah, very good. That's a great question. Thanks for that. Both the Czech Republic and Slovakia in the 1990s, surprisingly enough, preserved a relatively independent constitutional court. So Andrej Babiš has felt like being under constant attack of the constitutional court, and there was a change in the electoral system relatively briefly before the election. So the constitutional court also is a political player. I'm not denying that at all, but it was not a pro-government political player in the previous period, and that's very interesting.
Right, open to the floor.
Good evening, Michael Lee. I'm teaching here, and in an earlier incarnation, I was the EU's chief negotiator with the Czech Republic at one stage.
Thank you.
So, yes, I won't say I brought the Czech Republic into the EU, but I did play a certain role. I just got 3 points really. The first is, what else would we have expected? Were our expectations not too high to begin with? Didn't we think that just by sprinkling a little bit of Euro dust over a system with very little democratic tradition, except for the interwar period, for a brief period, and in most of the other countries, scarcely at all? And aren't we seeing a lot of continuities, in a way, with previous situation in what you described? Attitude towards women, for example. I remember perfectly well in the communist period, although there was sort of superficial equality with women in low-paid jobs, but anyway, so continuities, that's one point. Another is that these developments have been taking place against the background of similar developments throughout the democratic world of one sort or another. Not identical, and you focus rightly on the specific features of the Czech situation. But if you look really, populism, nationalism, demagogues, starting with the United States for a 4-year period, who knows whether we're going through a democratic interlude or what will happen there. And therefore, couldn't one see this as part of a broader tendency within the democratic world? And just finally, isn't the system showing perhaps some resilience, to use the cult word of the moment, and the fact that there has been a coalition, albeit, as you say, a right-wing coalition, and amongst parties that may not agree with themselves normally. Nonetheless, you look at Israel, where this happened as well, and finally Netanyahu was thrown out through a similar process. It's not inconceivable that this might happen in Hungary, and it looks as though it has happened, or it's in the process of happening in the Czech Republic. So might there not be some more underlying resilience than we might have thought?
As to your first question, with the expectations being too high, I fully agree, and that's exactly what I wanted to express with those, Western dreams, which went even further, because they believed into a new ideal of democracy somehow coming. So I completely agree, and yet I would probably somehow I would have betted on the institutional continuity more than the result shows. Somehow I would think that 30 years is a long time. It's almost as long as communism. Come on. So if the communist dictatorships took 40 years, then this is 30 years. So it's really a long time, and I would simply I would have betted on the institutional framework more. Then whether some of the fallacies are sort of globally shared, very much so, and that's also why I bring them here. I don't want to. I used the word Sonderweg before, but I don't believe in that. I think we have to bring that and see what the current challenges really are. And for me, the most dangerous development really is the retreat of traditional ideologies and cleavages. Because there are, the class divide, the economic class divide, was only created by the democratic governments in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. So there really are huge income differences and property differences. And now you don't address that in an election. I think there's something wrong about it. And on the other hand, I would say Germany is the only one of the few lucky cases in which the Social Democrats still may form a government. Otherwise, Social Democrats are really under huge pressure of these new parties. So that's definitely a risk for everybody. And then this resilience and the broad coalition building, yes. And that's what I was ironical about it, but I started preparing this lecture when I expected Andrej Babiš to win. And all the polls expected him to win. And then there was this, tiny little share that changed the whole situation and then created a relatively safe majority for this broad coalition. And as you said, Hungary is trying to do something similar in their attempts in other countries. Yes, when this populist leader still can lose the elections, that means that something is still working.
Other people, Hans, I've got hands going up full leather. Anna, I'll be with you in a second. Please, first, you.
First of all, thank you so much for coming. It was a very interesting lecture. I'm Sam. I'm from the United States, and I have the tough task of following up Professor Lee's questions. My question is on, you spoke about the binary kind of referendum nature of elections in these countries. And I think we see that a lot recently in the United States as well. But we kind of frame that as an issue of ideological polarization. But you also mentioned that a lot of these parties are non-ideological or even anti-political. So I guess my question is, what are the policy stakes of these kind of binary choice elections, and what are these like existential risks for the parties that lose besides just losing power, election to election?
Right, one or two more if you don't mind. Anna, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. My name is Anna Rackman. I'm a professor here. I had the somewhat remarkable experience of negotiating with Klaus, who was your finance minister under Havel, World Bank Support Program. And one of the key elements was the mass privatization program, the very rapid distribution of equity of the state ownership to the population, which led to a concentration of assets in the hand of some few, which of course empowered those, probably the Babbage and others. My question, that was, they were very proud of it at that point in time, and was a model for the rest of Eastern Europe, and in all cases took a similar path. My question to you is, to what extent is this reallocation of rapid allocation of assets, of wealth in the hands of a few conditioned the split in the society which we experienced? Was it just a flake of history, or do you think it's something what you see today has something to do that an economic elite benefited massively, or it created an economic elite? Second question would be, aren't you a bit too pessimistic on the institutions? I mean, I teach development, and normally I look at other countries, but I mean, you know, we see in all countries periods where, you know, it seems as the distrust in institutions weakens, but then they come back. I know Romania very well. You know, certainly we see that all over. We see all of a sudden the police being empowered again. We see the court being empowered again. Then it falls. Isn't some of it just the periods of evolution over time? Thanks.
Thanks. There was a woman at the back. I saw her hand go up. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Katie, and I have a question. If I'm understanding correctly, you're forecasting that a pattern will develop of populist parties continuing to gain power as people choose to, I don't know if this is working, as people want to vote against whoever they consider part of the establishment. What is the pathway out of this pattern, and is there a way to restore trust and legitimacy in democratic institutions?
We'll have another round in a minute. Adéla, do you want to answer?
Oh. I'll try to be very brief. As for the dichotomy within elections, you know, I think it's a bit more understandable in majority electoral systems, you know, where you have two parties. But what so our system, which is relatively, you know, clear, proportionate system, exactly allows 30 parties to run and 8 to 11 parties to make it to parliaments and somehow building coalitions. But you know, the idea of that system was that it represents different groups of people. And then I would in fact jump to one of the later questions. Sorry, your second question, Hannah, that now the parties are not representing any understandable segments. You know, if for example, my parents who are in their mid-80s, they're sick and old and poor, and if they vote for the right-wing coalition, then I think something is wrong. You know, somehow people do not respect their own. I mean, people do not see their preference, their interest anymore, and that's why I mentioned this you know, retreat of traditional ideologies and of the divide. So there's a mix of that. Then as for Václav Klaus and so who was the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic in the 1990s, and he was the author as Finance Minister of Czechoslovakia of the privatization scheme. He was a, you know, Thatcherite ideologist, and he managed to somehow transform the question of privatizing certain public companies into completely delegitimizing public ownership as such. So there was this translation of, you know, what would you privatize, how and for how much, to it simply has to get out of the hands of the state, because whatever happens, it's more efficient than what we're having. So you know, that was, I think, a real crime of the 1990s, because then the whole economic transformation was basically subsidized from the income from privatization, from that you know, selling companies to either bigger owners like Andrej Babiš or other companies. As for the institutional criticism that I have, yes and no. I believe we need that criticism to actually pay attention to institutions. So I would also do that in the internal debate. And where I would really see a critical collapse of institution is current Bosnia, for example. You know, there is this very complicated system of representing different communities at different levels. So Bosnia is known for having just, I don't know, 6 or 7 million citizens, but 14 parliaments. And nobody cares, and it has been a long story that the institutions did not have simply any respect of anybody. And now we start saying like, well, Bosnia might again fall apart because of all the divides. So that's what I want to prevent, and I think if people do not care about it, do not care about keeping laws and rules, that is a problem. And one could also say that maybe a cultural issue, because we always look up to Germany and Switzerland, where you simply say, let's not, here in Italy, I just saw these chairs of cafes left there overnight. And I was like, oh, somebody would steal them back home. So somehow that is a cultural thing, but it's also a historical institutional thing. That's what I wanted to expect. And the same that goes to restoring trust. I think that this systematic criticism might actually, stop people and say, well, should we actually keep the COVID rules? Because it's our COVID and our country and our people who will die. There's another crisis, yet another wave going on in my country right now.
Further questions, please? Yeah.
Thanks so much. My name is Jay Colina. I'm American. I'm curious in our lives, not for the people in this room and studying these topics, how should we try to engage and include those that have become anti-political and maybe don't see the value in going beyond feeling and taking down someone like Babiš or Trump, or being so emotional and looking to get, maybe it's more technical or more invested in the civics. I'm curious, do you have any examples of how you do that in your own or in your research, what might be effective?
Just one more.
Yes, I think my question is, my name is Martin. I come from Peru in Germany.
I know that one, everybody else.
And my question is very similar to Jay's. How you became interested in this idea of oversimplification of politics as perhaps one cause of the democratic recession. And I was wondering if you see it as a way forward to help improve democratic stability, to perhaps have democratic parties that present during an election campaign, let's say it, instead of oversimplifying, perhaps presenting democracy in all of its nuances and complexities, if that is an electoral, if there is a case electorally speaking for such a party, and if that is perhaps the way of reverting a tendency of oversimplification. Thank you.
As for really reducing ideas for people's engagement, that's not my mission. I'm a researcher, so I am always analytical. But of course, I'm also a citizen, an active citizen, and I also believe that somehow it should work for wider parts of the society. But the analytical approach can, of course, somehow decode the complexities that we're in. So I think it is useful to do this really detailed, I simply still reread the newspapers and texts from the 1990s, and I just keep being shocked that they include something different from what I had read in them, back in the 90s. I was already a university student, and I did read the same newspapers, but I did not decode them in the same way. I couldn't see the lack of debate on privatization and so on. So it's about, really enticing people to read especially all the digital clouds around them, sort of rationally. Then as for the general debate, I think it has to draw attention to, once again, relevant, rational choices offered by politics. And I would simplify these on basically, what does the party or the new movement say about the public sector? What does it say about financing healthcare? What does it say about pensions? What does it say about financing education? We still have free university education in our country. People get that education that Mark witnessed, for free. Yes, you have to survive in Prague. That's certainly, the difficulty. I mean, economically survive.
I could manage to survive in Prague.
You don't get it economically. You have to survive economically in Prague, but otherwise you get the education for free. And all this is at stake, at every election, because all these ideas about how people are better motivating if they pay, they would come up every time. So rational options about basically, the public service and priorities of the public sector. And then my last comment is on it's very difficult to do all that with the digital technology, surrounding us. So politics becoming marketing instead of presenting ideological options is a result of that. It's exactly, we just discussed that a few moments ago. It was about, if there is such cheap political PR available that you just tweet from meetings or whatever, then you just do it. But it's true that you are really switching off traditional politics. I heard a story from the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from the Czech diplomats, and I said, so how has it changed, through the COVID? And they said, well, we didn't travel to Brussels so much because their work is about, meetings in Brussels, basically. So we did all that online. I said, so is that better? And they said, well, it's actually very difficult. We didn't reach a single compromise during that time. And I said, oh, what? They, well, you don't simply talk to people over coffee. You really need that informal contact, because online, being video recorded and watched by everybody constantly, even if it's a closed meeting, you can't really build a compromise. So what I'm trying to say by that is that politics is also changing through the technology very substantially. It's now really my new interest, because we have to describe it. It is in this sense, it's in spite of all the continuities that I respect and believe in, there is a discontinuity with the digital technology actually really coming in.
I'm jumping back in again, sorry, ruthlessly using my position as chair. Just a couple of points that relate to what you might describe as democratic theory. Because I was very struck by the fact that you have such a portion of this question mark with the majoritarian system in the Czech Republic, and also in other countries. That's debate or creation of the kind of parties that offer clear political choices that you're talking about a moment ago. Easy question mark. Is it imaginable to simplify the party structure by using majoritarian law in the Czech Republic, or maybe other countries too? Although the next question I have to ask is something I want to pick up on, because you brought it up, and I think it's very important. You were talking about how every single election becomes a referendum, how it's seen as an existential choice, yes or no. Is that being caused by the nature of politics, the political climate, the political culture, or is that a political marketing? I don't know. I'm not expressing this very much, but it's something we see in every single country. I'm thinking my own country here, this yes and no, the referendum on Brexit was so alien to British traditions, and yet that's what we were faced with. Question mark.
I almost have to keep it there. With the majority system, yes, it should, in theory, it should be, easier for populists to abuse and win a landslide, victory. But the system has other checks and balances. I would say the US system, it was simply not so easy to win the US election either for Trump or for Biden because of all the regional differences and so on.
No, I was arguing almost the contrary. I mean, is it possible to imagine that with a majoritarian system you would compel forces to coalesce and offer therefore clearly opposite programs?
Well, for example, we have a two-round majority system for the Senate, for the upper chamber of the Czech Parliament, and it really produces very different results. So Babiš never had such a majority as we used to have in the proportional system. And as for the election and referendum, yes, I think it's a marketing. I think it's political rhetoric, basically. It doesn't have to do anything with the situation, and also historically these sort of appeals to that this is a special moment when you also can switch off democracy for us. I mean that's how fascist and Nazi regimes got established. So whenever you say this is not normal, this is special, and you just limit those differences, don't think about them and go for this, I think that's what I feel is tricky and dangerous.
Well, two more questions. Yes, at the back. Two ladies. I can't see who you are. Too far away. I've got my glasses on. Name and country.
Hi, my name is Valentina. I'm Colombian American. We talked about the intersection between technology and politics, for example, especially campaigning. It's a huge one. I think my main question is, for example, like I come from Colombia, and it's a big issue that we have. I mean, worldwide, honestly. In the US, Brexit, for example, it's a huge issue that we have with technology and cybersecurity overall. So my main question is, do you think that technology is creating fragility to democracy as a whole? And what are your recommendations as to like how we could regulate this gap that we have between technology and politics overall?
And second.
Thank you so much for this really interesting lecture. My name is Faith. I am from the States. You began your lecture talking about the recent trip of Le Pen to go see Orban, and then recently, following the Polish Constitutional Court's decision, a lot of French candidates have shown support for that decision. So I was wondering if you could talk about how the Eurosceptic rhetoric and decisions of leaders in the Central European region impact the actions and strategies of populists in the broader EU. Thank you.
Thank you.
To start with the digital technology, I mean the original idea or dream it came with was that it would actually bring a completely new level of democracy, because you could vote online, or you could read on politics online. Once again, these politicians would share tweets, during the meeting. You somehow get to know about stuff much faster. You can watch parliament sessions online and all that. So it seemed like it would actually enhance the political participation and all that. And then something slightly different is happening, and we all feel that. And I think that we have to understand, and we have to analyze that the digital technology is not, that technology is not neutral, that it involves different power moments, power elements and all that. And I think we're still used, although we have been studying technology for so long, we're still used to thinking about it as a neutral, just an instrument. And that was, for example, a major sort of asset and attraction, and at the same time, I would say, problem of the Czech Pirate Party, because they're mostly very young IT specialists, who really focused on the matter of digitization of the public administration, and of not believing into copyright and feeling like all work should be online. And somehow that was really attractive for young people. and you feel that there is something very, anti-establishment, anti-culture in that. So if publishing books, if a book, never is a book that you just can't put online, that is something that seems to be like one of the pillars of our civilization, that there is a copyright. And so I think there is something very subversive in the digital technology. Attractive, yes, but also subversive, and we have to be aware of that. And then as for, if I may, transform the question into the case of different Eurosceptic coalitions in the European Union, and I remember that in the peak Eurosceptic years of Václav Klaus, he was very close to the British Eurosceptics in the European Parliament, for example, and now it should be the French before their presidential election going to Hungary. I mean, that doesn't make sense, and it's really about building coalitions. And following my argument, I think it's very important if there won't be a solid regional coalition in Central Europe. For several years it seemed so, and in the immigration crisis it seemed so that it would be the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Austria even really working together. Now, if Slovakia fell out of that, and if the Czech Republic would fall out of that, it makes a great difference. There is no Central European coalition against the European, not only union, but values, really. That would be a great deal.
Brilliant. One last question.
Hello, my name is Rory. I'm from the United States. My question is, I guess two questions. First, what role do you think the security apparatuses of the former communist countries, former Warsaw Pact countries play? The Babiš is alleged to be connected to them. And second question is, he's made statements that indicate that he's looking towards a peaceful democratic transition. Do you find those statements credible? And if yes or no, then why?
Sorry, I didn't understand who is making the.
Oh, Babiš himself.
Okay. Yep. Very complex questions again. As for the secret services of the communist states, I mean, they obviously played, technically speaking, they played some role in the beginning of the transformations, because these people, there were huge amounts of people who were trained, especially as their employees, and they somehow transformed into the early private security agencies, and they were part of companies and so on. So this was their transformation, which is completely unmapped. We don't know much about it because it's individuals having their individual careers. And I think that was important. What was not important and what was made to the center of attention were exactly these collaborators who were very often pressured to sign their collaboration. They were simply contacted by the police, and they tried to survive those cafes with their leading agent or whatever. And these people wanted to shake it off. And this was made to the center of attention, like this is the real danger, having these people around us. So I don't believe into that. And there are big institutions like the state, the government run Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, which really sits on the old secret police papers and still picks up little pieces that would somehow play a role. So I don't believe in that. I think we have to understand, once again, analytically understand the role within the communist regime. We have to understand the role of these professionals after 1989, but that does not happen by scandalizing individuals in the newspapers. Babiš's collaboration with the Secret Service, which is a matter of court cases, it's a lengthy story. But he, as an employee of a foreign trade company, he as a person posted in Northern Africa in the 80s. You know, he obviously was a collaborator of the Secret Service because everybody had to report to the Secret Service and so on. So I think also there, this is not, I made the point, but just to show that he has all the negative traits and still he could win an election. You know, that was my point, and I am not deriving anything from his cooperation. And as for his statements for democracy, I don't think he really understands. You know, I think that's rhetoric because he's a ruthless businessman. That's what he is, and I think he really did run the state as a company, you know, in that he was right. And he really understands these people, like these fellow politicians and ministers, as employees. He's like, oh, I don't like you, off you go. You know, yes, he learned the procedure now, but I think, you know, back in his mind, it's still a company owned and run by him, which is really horrible to imagine.
I can't remember one last question that you got today. I can't remember last time we had a 45-minute question time.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Charlotte and I'm from the US. So I'm wondering, I understand that you're a democratic activist, as was mentioned previously. So given the pattern we're seeing in numerous countries that became democratic or were democratic from the beginning, can democracy be saved in these countries?
Yes, we can. Well, we have to save it. You know, I think all of us as intellectuals and university graduates, so we have to rationalize the debate and of course be active. But rationalizing the debate, I would say, is our mission really.
I mean, by rationalizing the debate, you think that intellectuals have got to be here. We go right the way back to your first talk when you first came here with Backlash talking about Howard. But intellectuals have got to re-intellectualize the debate. That's the point.
Yes, it is, but it's also about being critical, you know, because you then said, come on, are you critical to Václav Havel? And I said, yes, I am, because I think that's what rationalizes Havel, you know, although I adore him as well, I admire him, but I think we have to be critical, and therefore we have to be critical to the transition story and to the, you know, current winners of the Czech elections.
My students already know that they're all Havel icon.
I know.
Adéla, Gjuricová, thank you very much.